Good morning, everybody. Dear Sir Jeffrey Nice, dear Professor Nevenka Trump, dear Professor Robert Muharremi, everyone at RIT Kosovo who helped organize this important conference. I'm glad and honored to be today here with you and for the opportunity to address you. Let me start by explaining the concept, or rather the idea, of our political movement almost 15 years ago when we sprang in the political scene of Kosovo. We were formed on the 6th anniversary of liberation of Pristina on 12th of June 2005. We started not with a different answer, but with a different question. At that time, Kosovo was considered a territory which lacks status. And we said, no, every territory in the world has status. This status might not be the desired one, but certainly there is one. What we lack is not status as territory, but freedom as people, and political name of this freedom we lack is self-determination. So this is a different problematization that emerged in Kosovo with our political movement. But there was another aspect of raising a question rather than giving a different answer. And that is as follows. While considering Kosovo a problem in whose solution we should make Serbia a partner via negotiations, we started again with a different problematization. And that is, Kosovo is not a problem. Kosovo has many problems, and one of them is Serbia, but also UNMIK as bureaucratic administration. Therefore, it was a problematization different in twofold manner. So we were born not out of a different answer to political challenges of the time, but with different questions. And I think this is one of the reasons of our endurance in time. The theme of this session is post-transitional and strategic narratives about the Kosovo War. As such, I want to break the theme down and focus on two main things to open this session. First is a more theoretical approach towards the concept of transitional and post-transitional justice. And second has to do with the strategic narratives and their need when it comes to Kosovo War. The study of post-conflict Kosovo presents an important opportunity to distill lessons that can provide guidance for post-conflict transitional administrations. In the early days of the transitional administration, the effort to rebuild the judicial system and establish the rule of law in Kosovo suffered from a number of challenges to its credibility and legitimacy. The administration failed to involve generally the local population in areas where ownership in the transition process was crucial to the administration's success. A substantial number of these measures fall within several basic categories, such as the lawmaking process, the judicial infrastructure, and most importantly, accountability for war crimes committed during the war. During all the years after the war in Kosovo, we have continuously had problems with understanding and accepting what transitional justice is. That might have led to a direct failure of international involvement being able or willing to phase out as local capacity increases. This process should have been accompanied by an open dialogue between the transitional administration and the local population on the status of the legal system and the reform progress. Mutual understanding among the international community and the local population regarding the starting conditions, the phased approach, and the ultimate goals of the legal reform process could have served to harmonize expectations and promote the legitimacy of the transitional administration. But we all know that did not happen. Instead, the international community and our own previous governments as well did not anticipate the need for accountability and firmly demonstrate a long-term commitment to achieving the crucial component of any reparative effort. However, if we want to deal with the past properly, the victims and alleged perpetrators are entitled to a process that addresses all the relevant data involved, and this process must comport with relevant international standards. International commitment to this process must be sustained and demonstrable both within the affected locale and abroad. The failure to do so jeopardizes the entire enterprise, as it has been doing for years now. One thing we ought to bear in mind is that transitional justice refers to the view of justice associated with periods of political change, as reflected in the phenomenology of primarily legal responses that deal with the wrongdoing of repressive predecessor regimes. In the wave of post-Cold War transitions and political fragmentation, the phenomenon of transitional justice has accelerated and appears to have become a permanent feature of our political universe. What has long been conceived of as an exceptional post-conflict rule of law has now become the norm, reflecting that we are living in times of ongoing conflict and security concerns, and that this comprehensive discourse is apt to formulate foreign policy making in the current international affairs. So we should be careful. When it comes to the narrative surrounding the Kosovo War, it is important to notice the need as well as the aim to create villains out of KLA and establish specialist chambers as a legitimate construct that Kosovo in fact very much needed. That is not true. We did not need specialist chambers, nor did we do a smart thing by establishing it. That is not to say we should not address all the crimes that happened during the war. We should. It's just that we did not need an establishment based in The Hague that allegedly functions within Kosovo legal framework to try and clean the mess that UNMIK, EULEX, and to some extent ICTY made, while at the same time doing absolutely nothing to actually bring closure. We may not understand the real negative consequences of this establishment, but the truth is, we have seen nothing yet, and the upcoming years are going to reveal the real price we will have to pay for the establishment of these chambers. These narratives that we have been witnessing for years now are gaining weight and importance more and more due to the fact that Serbia is pushing them forward, but also due to the fact that we are not working on establishing any counter-narrative. And that is what we need to do now. We need to establish that KLA was not some criminal enterprise, but in fact it was a liberating army. We also need to question the legitimacy of specialist chambers, and while doing so, we need to properly address what has happened during the war. This is what should have been done years ago, but since it has not, here we are discussing about it even 20 years after the war. It is true that there have been several initiatives undertaken by the different governments of Kosovo to allegedly address what happened during the war. All of them were only initiatives established to tick certain boxes and not to really address what happened. Even as I talk now, there's a new so-called Department for Transitional Justice and Support to Crime Victims that has been apparently established to take over the work of the Institute of War Crimes that existed and was seized without really doing much. The department seems like another hoax that has no operational strategy and is not clear how it will in fact address what happened during the war. Only after documenting and addressing properly what happened, we can assess the harm caused. It is of crucial importance to understand how important this is, because generations are dying and people are being left with the memories that are not even first-hand anymore. It is also important to include all that happened during the war. There were not only murders and rapes that happened. There were also immense harm caused by torture, imprisonment, hostage-taking, destruction of both private and identity property, and so many other crimes. Also, not only individuals were harmed. There were harms caused to communities, businesses, physical environment. These should all be addressed and not forgotten. This is the last moment for us to establish a new narrative, an accurate narrative about the war in Kosovo, by addressing what happened and assessing the harm properly. We have several examples that we can follow, and we do not need to reinvent the wheel in order to deal with the past as properly as we can. But what we need to do is have the greater good in mind when we address this issue and not rush into a new endeavor thinking we just need to tick another box. We need to be very strategic and careful about this. We have to engage the best experts of the field that we have and start a bottom-up approach that involves the people while helping us establish an accurate narrative that we can use not only to file a request against Serbia for genocide at ICJ, but also seek reparations for all the harms caused. Therefore, just as democracy comes from below with bottom-up approach, likewise self-determination and likewise justice, I believe. Only by dealing properly with the past will we be able to start building the future as we should, and as all the bearers of harm affected by the war deserve. The author Albert Memmi writes that history rests upon institutions. History rests upon institutions. We need history to rest. We have a restless history. We need for history to rest. Therefore, we need institutions. Institutions of justice. Not necessarily self-made, but certainly homegrown. We need normal courts for normal justice against war crimes and peace crimes, rather than special chambers for special treatment questioning liberation struggle of people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kurti. I assume that we will have no time for questions. We will have time for questions. Oh, wonderful. How long can you stay with us?
I can stay till
10 o'clock. Wow. So that is a huge privilege, first of all. And I think you will understand if we reschedule our program. And by this, would you mind to step next to me? And please, first question from the audience.
Thank you, Aidan Heher from the University of Westminster. Yeah, really good to hear you again. I just wanted to ask a kind of a broader question about transitional justice. It strikes me that it's something increasingly, as you mentioned in your speech, that has become a narrative in post-conflict reconstruction, that particularly Western powers have gone to places and said, to become a fully established sovereign state and to be a functional civilized entity, you have to engage in transitional justice. And we've seen that, imposed or certainly developed in a number of post-conflict societies around the world in the last 20, 25 years. it always strikes me that there is an element to which people in these societies can ask the question, why do we have to go through this when you've never gone through it? If we think, for example, about the United States has never had a process of transitional justice for what happened in the 19th century to Native Americans, or France for Algeria, or the British for what happened in Northern Ireland or Kenya, things like that. And I wonder if there's a kind of echoes of colonialism, essentially, with respects to this, and that increasingly societies are now saying, well, I just don't think we need to do this. To become a functional member of the international system, this notion that we have to reconcile ourselves to the past doesn't seem to be true, given that you didn't have to do it anymore. And that obviously has a knock-on effect with respects to how receptive people are to the process. And of course, it obscures the fact that many victims and survivors are left out of these initiatives because they're no longer seen as relevant. So there seems to be a kind of a double standards, if you will, with respects to how this process has been initiated.
I would rather now say something about what enabled this rather than what was the aim for what has happened, or did not for that matter. International presence in Kosovo definitely, because of its origin of humanitarian character, not only considered us as victims, but also sealed us as victims, depriving us of agency. So we were victims here to stay. And victims should be taken care of. Victims don't have the right to self-determination, just as patients in hospital don't have the right to self-determination, because it's the doctors and nurses that are supposed to decide for them. And this is how we were treated. In my viewpoint, international administration in Kosovo was like a hospital, where they don't ill-treat you like in prison during Serbian occupation, but nonetheless, you're not free. You're a patient. And patient has to remain patient. You have to be patient, like the etymology of Latin word patient. So this enabled what has happened or did not to us. This idea of humanitarian intervention, where you have to save certain victims as human beings rather than citizens of Republic who have rights. And then it is you, the international, who know best for everything all of the time. That's why we had this top-down command rather than bottom-up approach. And that's why we as a movement came with this idea of self-determination, which can never be brought from above. It always has to do with people. You don't speak of self-determination of leaders or self-determination of a government. You speak of self-determination of people. So we wanted to turn people into actor and factor of political and socioeconomic developments. So for me, agency of people, which has to come from people, with international solidarity where we can find, was always the right way forward. Nowadays, it did not change much. Transition as a word was not used first for transitional justice in our country. It was used first in economic aspects. Transition from so-called socialism into so-called capitalism. This is where the concept transition was first mentioned. And it started with privatization. They said, you have been destroyed, you have nothing, you have to sell everything. And expropriation via privatization occurred. So transition as a word was used for economy first. Just like, for example, stability was used much earlier by financial institutions than by political governments. So a lot of terms basically come from economy and finances rather than from politics and governance. So in this sense, once we tried economic transition, we also tried transitional justice. But the irony is that there was no transition, because everything was done rapidly. When you have transition, you mean some incremental change. You mean preparation. You mean planning. And you do them. But in Kosovo, there was no transition because everything changed rapidly. With one UNMIK regulation, we were supposed to shift from one system to another. So top-down command did things quickly, swiftly. And they called that transition without any period of transition. It was instant transition. So we all, one people, had to adjust to decisions of one man. Because UNMIK, not only that they did not, that people were not voting for them when they arrived or for their decisions, but inside UNMIK, they never voted for any decisions that they took about us. Likewise, EULEX, likewise, all international organizations. So, in a sense, these were more military structures with civilian costume. And what I see as the key liability is that agency of the victims has to be restored. So perhaps justice should not be, should have all its aspects, like retributive, reparative, restorative, because it's crucial to have people stand up and take over their fate on their hands. So we can discuss concepts and ideas. We can discuss debates about everything. But then again, we must always find a way towards the people for them to rise. Without that, we might be right, but we will continue to fail. So only for the people and with the people. With the people, I think success is guaranteed. I will end now by saying that we should work more and organize better the patients. The doctors will never let us out. You know, we will always be sick for them. So we have to organize from below and change things above.
Thank you so much. So, thank you also to elaborating or explaining self-determination. So it has nothing to do with borders. It has nothing to do with new states.
People.
It's self-determination of people, which probably will find out whether it's a new form of socialism ahead of us. Professor Sunčana Roksandić is nodding and shaking all the time, so I'm quite sure she's an expert, legal expert on corruption and transitional justice and transition processes. Please, Sunčana.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to hear your contribution here. I would like maybe shortly to share Croatian experience. Well, first of all, I must say what you were talking about transitional justice. It was recognized by some of the UN bodies starting from 2011 that they kind of were mistaken in a part, because in transitional justice, the emphasis was mostly on violation of civil and political rights, not on violations of economic and social rights. And from that period, it started slowly to be changed. We can see it from the mandates of different truth commissions. And I think that in Croatia, it was a big mistake to disregard privatization and negative effects that came with it. Of course, privatization is needed. We all need healthy economy, but it was done during the war. And to share the experience, what we did, because we didn't prosecute on time serious violation, economic crimes and violations of economic and social rights, we decided to change our constitution in 2010, proclaiming that those crimes have no status of limitation. And that means that you can prosecute them retroactively. And by that, people expected like, wow, finally, Croatia is ready to address many abuses, what happened in privatization during the war and after that period. But actually, and we even prosecuted our former Prime Minister, Ivo Sanader, based on that. But at the end, this process is still ongoing, and we have many constitutional doubts or criminal law doubts whether that was possible or not. And yesterday, it's quite clear that from the EU communication for Western Balkans, for the countries that want to become EU, the word corruption is mentioned a lot in the part of building the rule of law. So I was just, my question to you is then, what do you think it should be done to address properly and effectively corruption crimes so that the country can really breathe out and become successful as it can and have a healthy economy? Thank you.
When I mentioned privatization, which took place very early on after liberation, I mention it because we as victims were first expropriated and then treated institutionally to bring justice for the harm done to us in a very partial and non-adequate manner. So after being victims and sealed as victims, prior to justice, we became consumers. Not citizens of republic who create and produce, but victims who are supposed to consume. And since 20 years now, export-import ratio in Kosovo is 1 to 10. Our trade deficit is 40% of our GDP. And the fragile social peace that you see in Kosovo is thanks to remittances from diaspora. You know, 2/3 of our budget revenues are collected at the border. Only VAT is 3 times higher than direct taxes altogether. Income tax, property tax, and corporate tax, which is only 1/8 of the budget revenues. This means that the structure of our economy is the one of a Middle East country, which is rich in oil, with the difference that we don't have oil. We have our diaspora. Remittances from our diaspora are our oil. So this is the structure of our economy. So a lot of fight against corruption must be preceded by analyzing the structure of the economy you have. Because I don't think that people are poor or unemployed because of the culture of society, history of the people, or natural resources they have or don't, but because of wrong economic model. So what kind of economic model and what kind of structure of economy one has is very important. Therefore, to fight corruption, you should do some development as well. So you cannot just do anti-corruption in NGO campaigns and in with justice in courts. You need development, number one. You need some accumulation of capital. You need to produce. And on the other hand, I know the case of Sanader. These EU integrations, for me, are like, okay, now, we get out from hospital and we enter school. You know? Serbia, like prison. International administration, like hospital. EU integration, like school. You know, you're a student there, and all the students who are here, they know very well that they're not equal with professors, right? So, but nonetheless, I must say, I look forward to go to school. You know, I love schools. I would go back to university if I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. So, yeah, let's learn, let's become students again. And there will be some professors, but Europe taught us critical thinking. So let's be critical to our professors as well. And this might change one day altogether. So I would like to use EU integration for anti-corruption, but I'm afraid it has not been that possible so far because of this paradigm of short-term political stability. So when we fight corruption, we have to fight the ideology of short-term political stability and of brutal, abusive privatization, which rendered certain politicians the richest people in the country, and then you have authoritarianism. So authoritarianism did not land from Mars. It was done here. And this neoliberal privatization on one hand and paradigm of stability on the other brought these authoritarian people who can keep things in order. And last but not least, I don't want to speak about judicial reform, vetting process and all this. We should all do that. Increase professional assistance, trainings, because you know Kosovo has an embassy in Panama. Out of 20 embassies, we have one in Panama. And former Speaker of Parliament went there 2-3 times. Former presidents and actual presidents likewise 2-3 times. I don't know what they are doing in Panama really. You know,
Panama Channel, maybe?
Yeah, they have Panama Channel, but we have no fleet to go and exercise there. You know how well they can cruise. So, yes, we are going to fight corruption, organized crime. We will like decriminalize procurement, empower prosecutors, and so on. But the most important thing is for our next government to be able to produce some Kosovar Elliotness. Lead by example. Because all these structural reforms and so on and so forth, they can take time. And we don't have too much time. I'm saying Elliotness, not Giovanni Falcone, because of the tragic end of the second. So, Elliotness and our own, not that small Al Capones behind bars. So I think lead by example, where you empower certain prosecutors and judges with police task force, and judicial reform, which will take time, hand in hand, without forgetting what I've mentioned, development that we need, and our economy is so thirsty for, due to the model used so far and present structure we have.
Thank you so much. Omar was very long with his hands up, and then Valerie Perry.
It was very clear from your talk.
Can you stand up, Omar?
Very clear from your talk, your opinion on the specialist chambers. You're now Prime Minister of this country. What will your government's policy of engagement with the specialist chambers be?
In 2015, I voted twice against amending our constitution with famous amendment number 24, which created space for specialist chambers in our state. I voted against on 3rd of June and 25th and 3rd of July. Sorry, 3rd of August. Now, you may wonder why twice voting against. Because vast majority were against on 26th of June, 2015. And then the president we have today made tremendous pressure on his party to change voting. And then on 3rd of August, they brought again the same text without one word removed or added. And then with 82 votes out of 120, they passed in our parliament this amendment number 24. And it was a very unfortunate event. But interestingly, on 25th of August 2015, the same month, only 3 weeks after, then the government and Prime Minister signed Association of Serb Majority Municipalities in Brussels, the so-called Zajednica. So, specialist chambers on one hand, and Association of Serb Majority Municipalities as a demand of Serbia on the other, went hand in hand. So, a different narrative for the war and a new solution for the future. And that's why we became very radical at that time as a political movement. So we're not radical by character, but by topic. So August 2015 is a very important month.
Mr. Kurti, was it the time that when we visited Pristina, we had to wear gas masks? Was it the time?
It was that fall afterward.
Oh, that
Yes,
is the
exactly.
fall after.
Yes.
Okay,
So
now.
yes, that's.
Uh,
I just want to point out how political is all this. Once in office, I will need to do two discussions. One with specialist chambers. I'm really very curious to meet them. They have one leg in Kosovo, one leg outside Kosovo, but I want to meet with a brain, not with legs. And the other discussion we need is in our parliament, what we should do. What I will do is to try my best to make our normal courts functional so we render unnecessary specialist chambers. I must admit that one element where their concern is reasonable is a witness protection program. And with the new government, we will ensure that successful, effective witness protection program will be in place. This is one element which is very important. The other thing is that EULEX was complaining, rightly so again, is that many witnesses in court cases say something completely different from what they said in police station, in prosecutorial office, or with friends in cafeteria, without any consequences. Because many of these cases are not much built on material evidence, but on witnesses. So we really have, in reforming our judiciary, to have at the center the witness. The witness is very important in the reform of judiciary. And we will take best practices, get best experts to ensure this.
Thank you very much. Valerie, please. Mike. Yeah.
I need to speak loudly.
That's fine with us, but I think it's recorded for us.
Okay. Thank you. My name is Valerie Perry, and I'm with the Democratization Policy Council. And I'm curious to ask you, well, what message do you think we should all be sending to the European Union in the wake of the French no to North Macedonia and to Albania, which isn't only related to them, but obviously is putting the brakes on enlargement more broadly. And I'm interested to know how we can try to advocate for more effective policy in terms of enlargement, but then also how to make sure that the accession process actually creates the transformative change we say we want, while also addressing the internal weaknesses that we're seeing in the EU among its existing member states.
Well, one could expect, knowing history of ideas, that Germans would be thinking and French would like action, But we have the opposite now. It is Frau Merkel which says that we should continue and work and act, and we have President Macron who says that we should stop and think. I think that these should be done hand in hand. Of course, some introspection inside EU is needed, but not at the expense of enlargement. And I don't think that EU as a project can have an author. First, Mr. Juncker tried to say, no enlargement in my mandate. and we got Brexit. So EU is a very serious project. So serious that it cannot have an author. Therefore, it is very pretentious to believe that you can do something with EU. And just like 10 countries were included on 1st of January 2004, from Baltic countries to Cyprus, I think the Western Balkan 6 should be brought together in EU at some point. I know that it's not going to happen anytime soon, but as a vision and as action, it should be there. It's an unfortunate decision not to open negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia, because opening negotiations and membership are so far apart. It's so unfair not to open negotiations. On the other hand, I think that the reason why President Macron might have been skeptic is also because those who opened negotiations and opened chapters one by one did not democratize meanwhile. Namely, Serbia was opening chapters during EU negotiations, but that did not increase freedom, democracy, and well-being of people in Serbia. So we got used to EU integration as a process which is going to enhance what we believe to be not only European values, like peace, security, development, rights, freedom, democracy, and so on and so forth. So now it has become possible to advance in EU integration while regress in domestic policies. And I think this is a legitimate concern. But, you know, it depends with what motive you mention this and towards what goal. I think this should not be used to stop altogether EU enlargement, but for its own introspection, which historically viewing, Germans were doing much more than French.
Thank you so much. Another question is from the lady in the back. I don't know your name, but I hope you are one of those homegrown, new upcoming elites. So we have many of these homegrown Kosovo young intellectuals.
Përshëndetje. You mentioned that we should establish an accurate narrative of the Kosovo War. Why haven't past governments of Kosovo put much effort into doing so while in power, and how will this delay negatively affect the case of Kosovo? Thank you.
I haven't heard myself. Can you repeat the first part and please
Okay.
relax, we're all friends. No need.
No problem.
Just do that.
Why haven't past governments of Kosovo tried to establish an accurate narrative of the Kosovo War, and how will this delay negatively affect the Kosovo case?
How would you assess the war narrative of Kosovo and this? How would you assess it? How does it affect? Why haven't the past governments failed to
Yeah.
So, in short, how would you, in few words, meeting someone in a first class or some jet going through? And
No, the problem is the sounding of.
it's too
It's,
close to say.
yes, please. Yeah. Well, politics is about priorities. What do you put first is very important. And I think justice was never among top 3 priorities. They didn't have time for it. They were doing other things. This is number 1. Number 2, because, you know, certain things in life we don't do because we don't have time, right? And number 2 is that the narrative after the war was that we got saved. NATO is some kind of divine intervention, you know, like hand of God reaching us from the sky, like in Renaissance paintings, you know. So, and trying to get us out from this, yes, inferno. So I think that we were saved, but we forgot that not everybody was saved. So we survived, but some did not. 10,000 people were killed, among them over 1,000 children. 120,000 houses were destroyed, burned down, or damaged. So we were so happy that we survived that we've forgotten that some did not. And I think here is needed a bit of social and cultural critique of our country as well, and of ourselves, of all of us. So I don't think that there is a healthy critique without a bit of self-critique, you know. So in this sense, I think we as society must say failed. It's not only institutions of the system. And they perhaps enforced it later on. But nonetheless, we should have taken care much more about those who didn't manage to survive, because they were not lucky as the others. And third is that I believe that with a new government, which is going to turn towards democratization, transparency, justice, and development, agency of victims, of people in general, will rise. This is my hope. And it will be done from below. It's not that me is going to do it. I'm there to contribute to enable it. So I think of ourselves as new government as someone and something who is going to liberate the country from within. We have so much of suppressed wills and knowledges in all our institutions that must be liberated now with this huge political change that occurred on 6th of October. And this, I think, will bring a new viewpoint, not for the future only, but towards the past as well. Let me explain this French German once more for those who perhaps are and did not understand me. Just one sentence, like in history of ideas and in philosophy and so on, it's very much German philosophy and French Revolution, you know. So German philosophy and French Revolution. And all of a sudden, we have Bundeskanzler Merkel, who she wants to do a revolution, and we have President Macron who wants to think.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We have time for one last question. I see a lady. No. I see the lady behind you. Yeah. So I hope it's another homegrown talent.
Hello. So you're saying that Kosovo should file an indictment against Serbia for genocide, but how do you think can Kosovo prove the intent of genocide that has not been proven yet?
A small question for the end. I'm glad.
Yes, I think that now
The time will say.
No, I think that now is the time for the next panel. Because
Exactly.
exactly they will be talking about this.
Sorry,
Best
2 minutes
experts.
left, 2 minutes left.
Yes, I would just like to thank you all for this possibility, and I really hope you see in new governments chance which was not there before. In academia, in judiciary, in media, in all civic initiatives, because we have to empower people. It is us who will do it. It's going to be us or no one else. And now we have a unique opportunity that this time should not be missed.
Thank you so much. Please stay with us. I would like to.
Mr. Kurti, on the way out, remembered that he had failed to mention in his speech something that he wanted to, namely that the killing of Serbs at and at the end of the conflict has to be dealt with. And he's happy that I should, in one sentence, simply make the point that he meant to mention it, but it was overlooked, and it will be dealt with.